dive in. I want to talk about financial services. We're going to talk about insurance. We're going to talk about leadership. You know, I can help. It would be interesting to talk a little bit about insurance, even with what's happening right now in the right, because as an insurer, you must be thinking about all the complexities of geopolitical tensions. But um, I want to go back and ask you to walk us through your professional journey, because it is one of incredible tenacity and focus, uh, and um, and I think it's important for us to tell that story.
Well, thank you, and it's great to see everyone here today, and it's a real pleasure to have an opportunity to come and talk to you all, and I hope we have time for Q&A at the end. I'd love to hear what's on your mind and what's of interest to each of you. I feel very blessed with the career that I've had. I started working, well, you can probably tell from my accent that I'm originally from Australia, but I've had the opportunity to travel and live in many different countries, and my working profession started when I was 17, straight out of high school. I came from pretty humble beginnings. Dad was actually a coal miner, so we didn't have a lot of money, but we didn't ever go without, is the honest truth. So when the opportunity came after finishing high school to get a job, I jumped at the chance, and I didn't know what a Citibank was, to be perfectly honest. But I was willing to do any job that was going to pay some money. And I started with them, and they offered to sponsor me through university at night. So I completed my undergraduate degree that way. And then I also did my MBA. And I had a tremendous opportunity with Citi, and I worked there for 28 years. I started in bank reconciliations and basically moved into different jobs every 2 years. I was given an opportunity to go work overseas when I was 27 with my wife, who's here.
Overseas from Australia.
Overseas from Australia. And we first went to Singapore, and I was responsible for creating a data warehouse for Citibank, which was the first of its kind. It's kind of a little bit boring now to think about data warehousing, but back then in 1997, that was kind of a pretty cool thing. So I built that for Citi's Asia operation. Then I went from Singapore to Thailand, first as the CFO of the Thai business. I was 29 years of age at the time, youngest CFO of a country for Citi in its history. And I did that for a while. We were there in Thailand for about 5 years because I went from the CFO role to running our retail operation back to Australia. And there I became the head of Citibank Australia. And then from there, I was promoted to run Asia Pacific's retail bank for Citibank, and where I had the opportunity to work more closely with Vikram Pandit. In 2015, I moved to Manulife. Manulife's big global insurer based out of Canada. In the US, where John Hancock, you may be more familiar with us by that brand name. And whilst we're Canadian, only about 20% of our profits come from Canada. The majority actually come from outside of Canada, and Manulife is the top 10 world insurer. I started off in Hong Kong running our Asia franchise. And then after doing that for 2 years, they asked me to come to Toronto and to lead the global operation, which I did in 2017. And I did that for 10 years before announcing my retirement last year.
There is an interesting question as to what triggered that thinking of actually retiring from that position. What did What did you want to have achieved? What are you thinking about the next chapter? Well, what was the catalyst for that decision? Because you have, at that point in time, the firm was doing incredibly well, and you had transformed the company, and the company was in its best state. I was looking at it last night. It was doing incredibly. It was incredibly strong, and at that point in time, you decided it's time to switch.
It's a question that I get often, and maybe sometimes that's because I'm a little bit younger than most CEOs that retire. I was 56 at the time of my announcement. I'm 57 now. And the honest truth is that
maybe I should retire next year.
Still young. But the honest truth is that with every role that I've taken, I've tried to have an endpoint in mind. And for the earlier part of my career, I typically said I was going to be in a role for no more than 2 years. And it wasn't like I was fixated on the 2 year horizon, but I would put the date in the diary of 2 years from the time I started. And I would mentally say, that's the day when I'm going to move into a new role. Or that's when I'm going to be, I hope to be in doing something different. And the reason I did that was because it created some urgency within myself to get things done. I think the problem that a lot of leaders have is they think they've got time. And if you think you've got infinite time, then getting things done with urgency and speed isn't necessarily a big priority. So I've always brought a lot of energy and urgency to what I've done. And I think that's because the way I mentally thought about it is it's like an hourglass that you've turned. And every day that goes by is one day less to do what you set out to achieve. And therefore, don't waste a day was the mantra that I always had. And when I took on the CEO role, it wasn't going to be 2 years, but I gave myself 7 years. I said, I want to be moving in 7 years. And I believe that what I want to achieve, I can do in 7 years. Now, it took me about a year longer than that. And I can sort of use COVID as maybe my excuse. But the honest truth is, you know, I felt that I had to achieve what I wanted to in a reasonable time period. And I think it's also important for leaders to hand the reins to a new leader to continue an organization. And I think CEOs often don't do that very well. Often great CEOs can run a company very well, but they don't know when to leave. And I think there's a whole lot of reasons for that. Sometimes it's ego, but in my mind, driving long-term sustainable success is about delivering the transformation that you set out to achieve, or largely delivering it, making sure that you've got good momentum with the business. And the third ingredient for me was having successors that could take the reins and then take the business to new heights after you've left. That was the formula that I had in my mind. And when I felt that I'd completed those three and had all those three ingredients, I felt it was time. And for me, there's many more mountains that I want to climb in my life. And I felt that I've climbed that mountain. And rather than hang on to it, I felt that this is the perfect time for me to transition and to move into a next phase of life with new challenges, new opportunities, and new hills to conquer, so to speak.
Yeah. So I want to go back to the word transformation, and you mentioned a few things, and I've read a little bit that some of the things that you've talked about before, and one is culture. But I want us to go through the transformation that you did in the last 7 or 8 years at Manulife. What it would entail. You almost redrew how the company operates, and then later on, I want to talk a little bit about culture and how, because my colleagues in the room know that this is something that we've been trying to do as well, uh, and I think it's crucially important.
Yeah.
In a high-performing organization. The other thing that some of my colleagues would recognize is this idea of urgency, and how do you actually convey that to everybody else, right?
Yeah.
It's one thing for you to have urgency. The truth is, there is nothing that you can do other than motivating other people to actually
Yeah.
act with urgency. And the last thing is this issue of leadership transition.
Yeah.
Um, but these are all sort of, some of them are part of the equation, but in some sense, you went to a company that was very established, right? And you almost decided, you almost took out a blank piece of paper and you kind of redrew the boxes and redrew, where we're going to emphasize. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah. I think it's a great question. It's a great point. Everyone talks about transformation, but transformation is hard. It's not easy. And the reason it's hard is because there's a lot of inertia in, especially large organizations, less so in smaller organizations, but inertia to do things the way they've always been done is very strong. And you should not underestimate how difficult it is to overcome that inertia and drive change. And the reality is, as much as people say they love change, people hate change. That's the truth. I can talk to a group like this, and generally, there's 1/3 of a group like this who love change. They live for change. Every day, they love the obstacle of doing things differently. There's another third that hate change. They cannot stand it. And then there's a group in the middle who don't mind change. They don't want to be the first adopters. And when they see a momentum sort of forming, they'll jump on the bandwagon, but they don't love it. They're reluctant. So there's typically these three groups.
Our guru of org change is sitting right there.
Right.
Todd Jake.
Okay. So perhaps this resonates.
No, he was nodding.
And the problem is, everyone in this room thinks they're in the first group. We're the people that love it. The reality is you're not. And maybe with a group like this, there's a stronger skew towards the first and second group, but you always have people that hate change. And for me, it was trying to help people understand and give greater self-awareness to folks that there is this resistance because you change an organization person by person. The analogy I often used to try to help people appreciate that this is difficult, that change is hard, is I would talk about, tennis. If you've ever played tennis, and let's say, for example, you're right-handed, you played right-handed tennis. If tomorrow someone tells you need to play left-handed tennis, that's not a fun game of tennis. You're playing very awkwardly, it's uncomfortable, you're not playing well, it just doesn't feel good. So your tendency is to put the racket back in the right hand and get on with it. But obviously, if left-handed tennis is what's required, you got to stick to it. So the first thing is just to accept that there is a resistance to change and that people hopefully can be a bit more aware of where they are so that they can begin their journey. I think the other thing that's critical for change and transformation is that you need to have two ingredients. One is you need to have a burning platform. Why is it that we need to change? If we don't change, for example, this is the stick. If we don't change, bad things are going to happen. And for us at Manulife, it was very clear that our return on equities was very poor. We were not driving shareholder value. Our customer metrics were terrible. So in some ways, my transformation journey was a little bit easier because it was easy for me to articulate a burning platform. Even though many people in the organization felt that everything is going great, it's all fine, I could clearly articulate the case for change. That's one ingredient. The second ingredient is that you need to inspire people for what you're trying to become. So what is the vision for the future? I can scare them about the case for change, why we can't stay the same, but that's not enough. I need to excite them about a future. And for us, it was about being the most digital customer-centric company in our industry. And people are proud of that idea. Yes, I want to work for that company that is that. So those were two critical ingredients. The third ingredient for transformation is, okay, I get why we can't stay where we are. I love this idea of where we're going. But then the third ingredient in any journey is, well, how do we get there? And that's where you obviously need to have a game plan, and articulating that and giving people clarity on what is required to drive the transformation to get to where we need to go was another key ingredient. So again, everyone talks about transformation quite a lot, but you have to really break it down into its ingredients, and you have to have a good appreciation for how much resistance there is typically in an organization towards change to really mobilize the organization. And then to your point, Costas, when you want to drive a sense of transformation in an organization, you as a leader have to lead by example. I can't talk about transformation and then not do it myself. If you want to drive urgency and speed, you have to be the example of that. And then you have to expect that your people, your direct reports, are also embodying that urgency or those cultural attributes that are critical to the transformation. And you can't, quite frankly, tolerate anything that's not consistent with what you're trying to achieve more broadly. I've said often that the CEO or leader is the metronome of the company. If the metronome is ticking slowly, the rest of the organization will tick slowly. If you have a metronome that is, 10 beats per second, then the organization will move to that same metronome.
I subscribe to everything you're saying, but and some of our friends here, you probably agree to that. You mentioned we mentioned culture, and in some sense, part of the transformation that you're describing, making the case, facilitating, explaining where we're going, facilitating, explaining that journey, getting buy-in, um, but in some sense, changing the culture within the company
Yep.
itself ends up being probably, in my view, one of the biggest catalysts for actually being able to make that journey.
Right.
And that's a central tenet of how you led the company, almost how you compensated people, how you rewarded people. And can you walk us through that?
I firmly believe that culture is what any company really has as its long-term sustainable competitive advantage. The reality is, whatever technology you implement can be copied, the products and services that you provide can be copied, but it's hard to copy a culture. And culture and your people agenda, in my mind, is the most critical ingredient of any formula for success. And it is often overlooked. People often think about the initiatives that get you from here to there and the tangible execution of the initiatives as being the key driver of transformation. But the culture of the organization is what will ensure that people do the right thing when you're not watching. People know what is accepted as right versus wrong, and that's ultimately, how things get made. Because you can't be in every decision room and adjudicate on what is right or what's wrong. The culture is what will actually help inform that. So I do think that is absolutely critical, and again, it requires a lot of time and investment. I would say that at Manulife, our culture was not very good. It was a culture that was focused on what people delivered and not on how they delivered it. And that was toxic because people would deliver results, but the way that they delivered them weren't necessarily always consistent with the right behaviors. And as a result, people were often combative and they weren't getting the best out of each other. So unfortunately, that was a problem that needed to be addressed. And the way I try to bring that to life at Manulife was that you're going to be recognized or evaluated and then ultimately rewarded, not just on what you did, but on how you did it. And that really sent a very important signal to the organization that the culture matters and it's how you deliver results that is equally important to the what you deliver. We implemented a system. We previously had a system of performance appraisals where you'd get a rating of 1 to 5. 1 was the best, 5 was the worst on what you delivered. And we added a how measure to that. So you got a metric for what you delivered, but you also got one for how. So if you were a 1 on a scale of 1 to 5 on the what, meaning you're a superstar, but if you were a 4 on the how, then you would go to the lower common denominator of the two for your overall rating, and that determined your compensation. So when we did that and when it affected comp, then everyone knew that we were serious about culture and about how, and vice versa.
How did you measure it?
Okay, so various ways, but what we used to help guide leaders was we had an anonymous survey. And again, I started this with myself and my own direct team. So you would get a survey. Let's say, for example, my direct report would have all of the people that report to them, give them a rating on the 1 to 5 scale. Their peers would give them a rating on 1 to 5, and then their supervisor would give them a rating. So you had that as a guide towards what they were doing, which was a little bit more easy to measure because it's tangible results. But then you got a how rating that wasn't blindly following this formula, but at least you had a data input to help support the argument. And it wasn't just, oh, my manager doesn't like me, he's giving me a bad how rating. You at least have data, and you had it from multiple sources, your supervisor, your peers, and also your direct reports. And you had a how rating. And again, in the past, if you were a 1 rated on the what and a 5 on the how, no one really cared because you delivered results. You're a rainmaker. But when we moved to this new system and when it affected compensation, and ultimately, if you were, a 5 on any of those scales over a period of time, you actually didn't have a role in the company anymore. But when we did that and when we started firing people, then people knew that we were a bit more serious about culture. And, at least that became a more important priority for folks in general.
We started something about sharing data on culture uh, for faculty. It never caught on.
No?
This was maybe 10, 15 years ago, where, but you're giving me ideas.
I'm going to say most people,
which is good.
it was firstly anonymous, this survey, and it was a data input. We didn't say to managers, you follow this blindly, but at least it made it a little bit more objective. And people were pretty good at their ratings. They were pretty honest about those assessments that were being provided.
That's terrific. Before we talk about other things, you mentioned leadership transition and how like if you're going to be holding yourself accountable to your 7-year timeline.
Yep.
At some point in time, in year 2, you're starting to see what's going to happen 5 years later. In year 4, you're already thinking about successors
Yeah.
in different groups. By year 7, you're almost ready.
Yeah.
Right. And how did you manage that?
Yeah.
And was your successor internal? Was it external? How did that?
So I believe that my role as a leader is to provide the board, because they're going to make the ultimate decision on who replaces me. I believe it's my responsibility to have at least 2 credible options for them to choose from internally to replace me. And that was one of my KPIs. One of my KPIs, as long as, along with the business results, the transformation of the company, the improvement in the customer sat scores, the improvement in the profitability. One of my metrics that I put on my scorecard was to provide 2 credible successors for them. And that was at least at the 5-year mark, so that they had a very clear view within that point for a couple of years to be able to assess a couple of individuals. And in the very first year that I was in my role, we already, with the board, started having conversations around the talent in my team. I was very transparent with the quality of the team, who's doing well, who's not, what are their development opportunities, and who I thought had the potential to 3, 5, 7 years from that point in time, who had the potential to actually be a possible successor. So we had very open, transparent discussions. I felt very good about having those. The board made that very easy as well. And then at the end, we ultimately had 3 people to choose from. One of those individuals said, I don't want the job. He was a credible candidate, but didn't want everything that came with taking on these jobs. And there were 2 individuals that did want the job and were very credible. And the board then had the opportunity to either pick from those 2 or go externally to see if there was anyone external that they wanted to consider. And I recommended that they do that as well. And they did that. They assessed the external talent, they assessed the internal talent, and they chose one of the internal individuals as, I guess, a complement to the process that we had. The other person that didn't get the role, that was a successor, left, which is no surprise. When you groom a successor and they have the ambition to want a role like this, they don't get it. They see that it's going to be 7 years before they get another chance, so they typically leave. And the other individual at Manulife that didn't get the job actually became the CEO of an American insurance company within 6 months of not getting the role at Manulife. So I felt that was, again, a compliment to the process that we ran and the development that we undertook to get people ready for the role. But I think it's a responsibility that sometimes boards don't take seriously, and they make serious mistakes when they don't think about transition early enough and rigorously enough. And I've heard from some board members saying, "Oh, we don't want to bring this up because we're going to offend the CEO. We're going to make him or her think that we're trying to push him out." But I think that's a mistake, and I think it should be a very honest, open conversation. And I think the sooner in the tenure of a CEO, the better.
Good. I want to pivot on 2 other topics before we open it up. One is AI, which is top of mind. that's how I tell people that we need to change. The whole world is changing, and we need to be pivoting with it. But you know, you run a large organization, and you were part of an even larger organization before, and you know how complicated it is to actually implement a sort of what could be a massively disruptive technology.
Yeah.
And now you're advising uh, sort of entrepreneurs and founders of companies that potentially are the disruptors, or they're thinking themselves about, you know, what do you think about what's going on right now, especially when you put your Manulife hat on? So this is a massive organization, global, and we are now trying to deploy, let's say, a capability. What do you think that is? How do you think it's going?
Yeah.
And in some sense, what are the pitfalls and the opportunities that you assess?
Yeah. So the first comment to make is that implementing transformative technologies at large scale in large organizations is really difficult for the same reason that I mentioned earlier. The inertia to do things the way they've always been done is a very powerful force. When you've got a team of 10 people, you can get them all in the room and you can say, we need to make these kind of changes. And it's kind of easier to implement technological transformation. That's why small companies are more nimble. They're able to pivot. Large companies find it much more difficult. Now, large companies have scale, and if you can drive that kind of transformation and change, implementing new technologies, it can be profoundly more impactful. And I believe that AI and the more recent iterations of AI are probably the most profound technological capabilities that we've seen for many, many decades. There's a lot of hype around AI. Every CEO is talking a good game. I listen to many earnings calls, and the buzzword around AI is significant. So the question is, who are the authentic leaders who are really doing this versus who are just talking a good game? And the answer is you can't really tell. It's very hard to tell on an earnings call because everyone's so good at telling their story. But I think it is a massive opportunity and it's a big threat. And I believe that in the next 2 to 3 years, you're going to see a bifurcation in large organizations, in big industries like Manulife, John Hancock, between the leaders and the rest, the leaders and the losers, effectively, based on how well they embrace AI and drive transformational change. For a company like Manulife, I believe that it should enhance profitability by at least 30, maybe 40%. That's how significant it could be or should be. If you think about 30% on almost $10 billion worth of profits, that's $3 billion. If you take that with a multiple of about 10 times earnings, that's a $30 billion market cap opportunity. There aren't too many $30 billion market cap opportunities that a company of Manulife scale will be able to pursue. So the prize is massive. And therefore, I believe that it is a transformational opportunity that in the next 2 years, you'll see those who are just telling a good story, getting their AI department to put a great PowerPoint presentation and tell it to the street, versus those that are embedding it in every step of their transformation. And it has to be led by the leader and the leadership team. They need to be living and breathing this. And I think every part of the organization needs to be embracing that. If I was at Manulife, which is, I guess, your question, I would have tasked every team with a 30% bogey. I would have said your goal and in your budget is that you have to deliver 30% improvement in profitability, whether that's revenue or expenses. And now, we've got to figure out how do we use the technology to actually drive that. Because if you try to motivate people to just drive the change, it's not going to happen. Unless it's in their budget, I don't think you're going to see the change. So I do feel that there is incredible opportunity. And I do think that in the next 2 years, you're going to see a big differentiation between companies that do really well and those that are laggards that are going to be, 10 steps behind and just doing good PowerPoint presentations.
So going back to org change, I think that's going to be, if you think about the journey that major organizations will have to undergo, sort of organizational change through this wave of AI is going to be sort of the journey that most places are going to undertake.
Right.
Do you actually think it's realistic that you're going to be able to see things in 2 years?
I do. I do think that. Well, for the great companies, yes. I think for the majority of companies, I think about 70%, there's going to be very little difference to today. They're going to have AI departments that they're going to fund. They're going to grow from 30 people to 150 people, maybe 300. And they're going to do a lot of things on the side. They might get 5% productivity improvement. That's the base case for 70% of companies. And that's kind of pretty comfortable for folks because there's not a lot of disruption. But I think the real transformative leaders in the next 2 years are going to reimagine their workforce. And it goes back to the change conversation. And in my mind, what's required, see, most change happens like this. People start with, this is my process. These are the 10 steps. And then they think, how can I improve that? And they'll say, I can make this 10 or 20% better. That's one way to do change. And it's a lot easier because you're starting with what's happening today and you say, okay, well, with the technology, I can make this 20, 30% better. But the better way to drive transformation is to not start with the current, but to start with a blank piece of paper and say, what is the ideal? What is the world-class process? And if you think about insurance, it's what is the best claims experience that someone could possibly have. Start with ideal, not what is current, and improve that. Start with ideal, and then try to fight all of the resistance points that are going to come in and say, no, that's not possible. You can't do that. So start with ideal and then negotiate away from that to something a little bit more reasonable. But I do think that great companies are going to drive that mantra. And to your point, the leadership needs to be driving that, and they need to start with themselves. And if you've got a leadership team that is fearful of AI, they're not going to be driving it, and therefore their teams are not going to be driving it.
Okay. I mean, I'm clearly an optimist, and I come from this world, but I still think it's going to go a little bit slower in these sort of massive organizations. And I think in part is I'll give you the example that I gave to our trustees. I know I'm being taped right now, so maybe I shouldn't say that, but we were talking about AI and jobs, and I want to go back to talking about that.
Yeah.
And I was explaining to them what we see in the business school, and we don't see it in our data, and our students are getting great jobs, but we're concerned and we're focusing and we're investing. And then we're saying, no, what are you talking about? Things are moving so fast. And I looked at them, I said, listen, I probably know more about this than any of you. And I'm more optimistic about it than any of you. But let me give you an example. And then I start and I say, let me give you an example of a large employer in the city of New York. And then I pause to dramatize the point, which is something that Todd would do in his class. And then I say the name of the employer, which is Columbia University. And they knew I got him, right? Because it's going to take forever to move this sort of ship that we're sailing here. And I actually think even great companies, and we talk about JP Morgan, they're not very different than Columbia. I mean, I've worked with some of these huge banks in the last 15 years, and because of people, change takes time. The capabilities are there, but are we going to change our capital markets business dramatically? Are we going to see headcount reductions in Citigroup by 50%? How long will it take for Citigroup to employ half of the people that they have? And I think that's measured in decades, not in years. What I think could be done in years is we could see dramatic improvement in product, right? Like what the customer experiences, and different types of products that were not available, right? And different types of sort of enhancements so that you as an agent or like you can actually do your job enormously more efficiently and drive profitability from that. So product again. Uh, but on the cost side, on the automation side, I think that's going to be slower. But I want to pivot to that because I want to ask for your views on what AI is going to do to the future of work,
Hmm.
which is something that is top of mind for us. And what are your thoughts about that?
So I think it's going to change the future of work. And the first thing I'd say, so I don't disagree with you. I think the majority of companies, firstly, are going to, you know, move through the change. It's like moving a big ship, right? It takes a lot of energy. But I'll tell you, when a company in each industry declares that 20-30% bogey, everyone else is going to panic and then jump on the bandwagon. And so you will get that first company that will happen much quicker than the cities of the world. The JPs are going to say, oh my God, we have to do things at a much faster pace, and there'll be transition. I do think that the technology has the capability to transform everything that we do in the workplace. I can't think of a job at Manulife, for example, or Citibank that is not going to be impacted. And I think one part of the equation is it should drive incredible efficiency improvements, circa 30+%. But to your point, I think the revenue opportunities are also massively significant. Manulife has 120,000 agents that sell our products. These 120,000 agents have a portfolio of about 1,000 clients each. They only talk to 15% of their clients, these agents, every year. The rest, the other 85%, they don't ever talk to. Why don't they talk to those 85%? Because the amount of effort and time that it takes to put into those discussions isn't worth the revenue that they will generate. So they make a concerted decision. They say, these prospects, I know if I put my time and effort into those, I'm going to get a payback. But for this 85%, I'm not going to get it. AI completely changes that equation. It creates an opportunity, for example, for an agent to have an AI agent, scan the universe of social media and other external sources and look at what those other 85% of clients have just done. Oh, this person has just had a child graduate, prepares a proposition to go to that individual and make an offer. And all an agent needs to now do is look at that offer and say, great, click yes, and out it goes. So that interaction that wasn't happening now is going to happen every 3 months. And that's going to result in a conversion of at least 10%. So that is a massive opportunity, and that just wasn't available before. We didn't have those kind of tools and technologies. So I do think it's going to change the workforce. I think the biggest problem will be that most people will look at this in a very linear way and say, this is what I do today. How do I now do it 20% better? Whereas the right answer is, let me start with a blank piece of paper and say, what is the agent of the future actually looking like? And how do I actually design my job around this technology rather than how do I try to find 20% improvement?
You think it may eliminate jobs?
I think it's going to eliminate jobs, yes. And my advice to people in rooms like this is that I would be less focused on, okay, these industries are going to be disintermediated, and more, I want to be the individual in that organization that understands the capability of this tool better than anyone else, because I can then be the enabler for the transformation that organizations are going to undertake. You need to be a guru with this technology, is my humble advice. And no matter what industry you're in, everyone's driving this transformation. But if you, in addition to whatever profession or industry you're interested in, can be an absolute guru in these tools and technologies, you're going to be a massive asset, because 90% of the workforce will not have great capabilities as it relates to AI, other than, yes, I can summarize an email and I can summarize a research paper and I can get comparisons done. But if you can be an absolute guru, then you're going to be, highly demanded, and I think your role is going to be indispensable.
I agree with that. And I keep telling our students that they need to be doing that. And now I'm telling our faculty. An email is going out that, we're going to start training them to become power users.
Yeah.
Uh, Last question, and then we're going to open it up. And that question has to do with insurance and the combination of climate, which is one factor that sort of is adding a layer of complexity in underwriting, pricing, risk, etc. And the other one is geopolitics, which you mentioned the arc of your professional career, and a significant portion of it was what I would say was this period after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 2015, where economic value optimization was reigning supreme.
Yep.
Right. That's how businesses behave. That's how governments behaved.
Right.
And I think after 2015, geopolitical thinking has actually started sort of entering our calculus. I think it started with the second administration of Obama with the EPP, which I'm sure you remember, uh, which was the beginning of sort of tension and sort of how do we deal with tension between the U.S. and China.
Yep.
And then from then on, this has moved on. And right now, business itself, uh, geopolitics becoming a major driver of how you make business decisions.
Right.
But when you're thinking about insurance, it's actually also a major driver of thinking about that. So climate, geopolitics, going back to your insurance hat on, what are your comments on that?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I'll try to be brief because I want to really open up and hear questions from you all as well. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I do think we went for a period through many decades of globalization and free trade, which basically meant that capital was allocated to the most efficient location, the best value for a dollar spent. And in that calculus, what was not included was the geopolitical risk. Because it was kind of benign. The geopolitical risk was kind of benign for several decades. And you didn't need to hedge that risk. Now you have to hedge that risk. And we saw that exaggerated through COVID. And having all of your eggs in one basket was a dangerous proposition. So we've moved to a world where geopolitical risk is now front and center again. And having diversification of supply chains is now much more critical. That comes at a cost. That's an increased cost of doing business, but it's an important part of resilience and the ability to perform through various cycles and through various environments. Now, there's ways to reduce that cost. We talked about technology being one, and there's also multiple locations that can be used to support operations, for example, that helps mitigate that risk. But I do agree we've moved into an era where geopolitical risk is now much more significant. And I think that companies are being valued on their ability to be resilient through that. And I think that resilience is not just true for geographies, but it's also true for resilience around technological risks. And therefore, cyber resilience is so much more critical than it ever has been in the past because of the tools that we're now using that we never used before. So I think that's now par for the course, not just insurance. Every industry is thinking about this, and they're being assessed and valued based on how strong their frame of resilience actually is. I think on the insurance front, we're moving to a world where in the past we used to have very generic ways of pricing risk. For example, as an individual, you wanted life insurance coverage. We'd look at your age. We'd know mortality tables. We'd ask you a question like, are you a smoker? And then you'd get a price. It's a pretty generic. You're in a group of hundreds of thousands of people, and therefore we're not differentiating the individual who maybe eats really well, exercises every day. I'm assuming you do all of this. You don't smoke, you sleep well, and so on and so forth. I don't differentiate that versus the individual that basically lives a terrible life and is a high risk. So the future of insurance, and this is true for health insurance as well as it is for climate risk, is getting ultimately to the segment of one. How do I personalize my insurance that I can cover you individually because I know you so well? which means that you may end up getting an insurance policy that's 70% cheaper than you were getting before. Now, it means that the riskier person's going to get a policy that's much more expensive. It brings into the topic of conversation genetics, and there's a whole ethical debate around that, whether genetics can be used in insurance policies, and I won't get into that. But I think we're ultimately moving into segments, much, much smaller segments that prices people differently and also rewards you for being a lower risk individual. And that is a good thing in general. But I do think there are some massive transformational forces that we're seeing. Technology is going to be at the forefront of it, but you're absolutely right. Resilience is something that I think is now being valued, where in the past it wasn't. It was just a world where the dollar of capital went to the best, most efficient use of it.
Okay, let's open it up for questions. Any comment? Yep.
Hi, Rory. Thank you for coming. So my question is quite simply about your professional career. I know most of my peers, including myself, can't really imagine ourselves staying with the company for as long as 28 years.
Yeah.
And I know you talked a little bit about loving change. I guess what was your equation there as you took along that long career path at Citi? I guess were there ever times when you thought about leaving, and why didn't you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I never really ever thought that I was going to be there for 28 years. And it's kind of almost crazy to think of being at one place for that long, to be perfectly honest. But I never saw it as a 28-year stint. And as I mentioned earlier, with every role that I took, I saw it as an opportunity to learn something new. And that's the big advice that I give a lot of students, is to really drive this mentality of learning. And every role that I took early on, in particular, was almost like a 2-year stint. And I gave myself kind of a sense of urgency around the role and about the ability to learn as much as I possibly could, and then to make an impact as quickly as I possibly could as well. So for me, I just kept getting these opportunities. I was being recognized for the roles that I was doing, and they kept throwing me in the deep end, giving me other opportunities that were challenging me. They sent me overseas, as I mentioned. That was phenomenal for a whole lot of reasons. But I always felt that I was going to try to learn more, and that seemed to keep coming for me at Citi. And I loved the culture, I loved the place, and the challenges were always there. I had new mountains to climb. Now, if I ever felt that those mountains weren't there, maybe I would have considered options to leave and to move on. But it just so happened that I kept getting these incredible opportunities and challenges to keep stretching and pushing myself, which I took. The other thing I'd say is that I had mentors early on in my career that really encouraged me to look at the opportunities, not from the perspective of whether it was a promotion and more money, but more from a perspective of learning. Can you learn more, even if it was a sideways move? And I think that gave me longevity as well. It gave me opportunities to move into roles that I would never have possibly done. For example, early on in my career, I went into collections. And for a banker, collections isn't a very exciting place. Collecting on debt is not a fun thing. But a mentor said to me, you can't lend money to someone unless you've felt how hard it is to collect it when they can't pay. And that was sort of like, my go and do that for a couple of years thing. And it was fantastic. Now, the benefit of that for me, when I became the CEO of a country, I'd done the roles that most people were doing in the company. So I could speak from experience, and I was a lot more credible, having done call center, collections, operations, finance, treasury, marketing. So yeah, my humble advice is try to find a company where the culture aligns with yours, and then look for opportunities. Don't stay in a role for 4 years. Look for opportunities to move. And if the company is not going to really encourage that for you, then maybe that's not the right place for you as well.
Other question? Thought?
First of all, Roy, thank you for validating my 45-year career of teaching organizational change and all the change management issues. And if you're inclined at 2:20, I've got a group of 75 MBA students, and if you can repeat everything you said this afternoon, it would be perfect. You would validate the entire course. What I want to ask you about is whether the AI implementation challenge as a change challenge is qualitatively different than the many challenges and transformations that have been part of your career.
Yeah.
You've had this lengthy career doing different kinds of transformations, the latest being Manulife. And the AI one probably started there, but is expanding exponentially year by year. But if we were to advise our students and just say this kind of change, organizational change, is not about just dealing with that 1/3 of resistors that are 1/3 of people who are resisting. This is about an organizational transformation of processes, of culture, of design, of purpose, of a whole bunch of things that come out of this. So it is truly a level of organizational transformation that may be of the highest we've seen. Would you concur with that? Would you have any advice about how to actually implement AI today using the change management thinking that you so capably described?
Well, thank you. And definitely, I should listen to your class because it sounds like an interesting one. And I do think that change is often the most underestimated aspect of leadership, which I think, validates the importance of your role and your class. But I would agree. I do think this is the most profound technological change agent or opportunity that we've seen, certainly in the 40 years that I've been working. And we've seen a lot of technology that's come in that time that has been transformative, but in my opinion, it pales into insignificance compared to the opportunity that AI and the broader Gen AI, agentic AI actually brings. Early on in my career, I remember, I became a guru in, it was called Lotus 123, and you may remember that. No one else in this room will. You do as well. Okay, so it's the forerunner to Excel, and it was transformative. I became I guess a bit of a aficionado in Lotus 123, and I learned how to program macros so that I could actually simplify work, and it was kind of transformative. But it affected probably 15% of what we did as a company. I don't think there is a job in a company like Manulife or a bank like Citi or JP Morgan, or quite frankly, any other industry that isn't going to be touched by AI and agentic AI. And I do think that is very uncomfortable for folks. But I do think at the same time, the leaders that are embracing this will be standouts because it's so transformative in its opportunity. And it's going to require a complete rewiring of the way work is done. And I don't think organizations are going to be prepared for that because people that are leading organizations, don't have the aptitude or the desire to kind of learn from scratch. These are folks that have had long, illustrious careers, and the last thing they want to do is to go back to the drawing board and figure out how this is going to work. What they'd rather do is to flick it to their AI department and say, just go and do this. But organizational change requires leadership from the top, and you need to be embodying that yourself in your own work. And it's not just summarizing an email. So I do think it's the most transformative opportunity. It's kind of scary for a lot of folks, but I think the prize is massive. And again, I just tried to articulate that for a company like Manulife with a market cap of about 70 billion. A $30 billion market cap opportunity is phenomenal.
I can tell you that the paradox is that, as you're sort of implying, revolutions don't usually start in the palace.
Right.
They don't undo their own sort of position.
Right.
And I can tell you here that our wonderful generation of millennial students are pushing us, and our dean sitting next to you is pushing us. And so we have sort of forces that are going to propel us to move into that, both in the education sphere and to preparing our students for the world that you're describing.
Yeah.
But they're keen to go there. But it is a large people issue. There's no question. People, process, organization, culture, everything you talked about. That's why I say I think you're right on in terms of the major stumbling blocks and challenges. And the companies that will be able to sort of put all that together will be the leaders.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I think you're right.
Okay. Roy, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Thank you for coming.
Pleasure. No, pleasure's all mine. Thank you.
Thanks.